afternoon and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got an incredible program lined up for you today. In just a little bit, our San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera is going to be leading a conversation with the director of Proceso Pacifico, Dr. Everard Meade. We've had him on the program before, so really looking forward to seeing what comes of this conversation. It's one of those guests that, as I've said before, wish this program was like 3 hours long just so we could continue the conversation. But that is what we're going to do today. But first, as always, let's start by taking a look at what's trending across the border, starting with a daycare worker detained by ICE. Now, witnesses say a Chicago daycare employee was detained at work during a drop-off time for children, reflecting the Trump administration's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. Alderman Matt Martin says the employee ran from a vehicle inside the Rayito de Sol Spanish Immersion Early Learning Center on Wednesday morning after being trailed by officers to work. Parents dropping off their children said they were stunned to see the woman detained at a daycare. A spokesperson for the daycare center confirmed that the woman who was taken into custody has taught at the school for more than a year. A Homeland Security spokesperson posted online that ICE agents did not target the daycare, but had tried to stop a vehicle when the driver refused to pull over. And staying in Chicago, a federal judge there has issued a temporary restraining order ordering the U.S. government to provide bedding and personal items to detainees at the ICE processing center in Illinois. Now, it's the Broadview facility, which we've talked about on this program before, and it has remained the main processing center during the 2-month federal immigration enforcement effort known as Operation Midway Blitz. Under the order, the federal government is required to provide clean bedding, mats, and other bedding, along with adequate sleeping space for detainees while they are being held there. Other personal care items such as soap and toilet paper must also be provided, and the government must ensure that there are enough bathroom and shower facilities for those who are held at the facility overnight. Moving on, CBP discovered almost 290 pounds of heroin hidden in one vehicle at the San Ysidro Port of Entry in Southern California. It is said to be the largest seizure of the drug in a single car. The confiscated heroin has an estimated street value of more than $13 million. The driver of the Chevy Silverado was a Mexican citizen who was a legal permanent resident here in the United States. Officers say they found 72 packages of heroin hidden in the air filter, the fender, glove box, rear seats, and the spare tire of the truck. Time now to bring in our San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera along with our guest for today's program, Dr. Everard Meade.
Ev, thank you. Rudy, thank you as well. Ev, let's get right into it. But I do want to say that you are with Proceso Pacifico, a group that works with communities afflicted by drug cartels in Mexico, Colombia. So let's talk about cartels because they are in the news once again, especially in Mexico. Someone just killed a very popular mayor, Carlos Manzo, in the city of Uruapan. How is this even possible?
You know, what's amazing is that this one's attracted this much attention. And I'm actually heartened by the fact that, you know, people are paying attention to this because it's really important for people to recognize that this is not atypical. This is something that in each of the previous election cycles in Mexico, we've seen new highs in political assassination. So mayors are particularly vulnerable, but so are police chiefs. So are campaign workers, candidates for office, people recently who have just left a municipal office. And in this case, you know, Michoacan is interesting because it's at the intersection of two things. On the one hand, you know, I would tell you that if you look at, you know, the murder of mayors, there's actually the Mexican Association of Mayors actually puts out statistics and case studies of the assassination of mayors. And if you look at their data, one of the things that you see is that it's not, at least in the last 10 years, it hasn't really been concentrated in the states that have the most drug trafficking organizations. It's been really kind of more geographic, and it's had as much to do with politics as it has to do with the narcos. So, for example, in the states of Puebla and Veracruz and in the south in Oaxaca, the numbers have been really high for a long time. Now, one of the things that we've seen recently is that whereas, for example, like states like Sinaloa have not had very much of this. They have lots of other kinds of violence, but they have very few candidates for office who have been killed. What you see in Michoacan is that Michoacan's kind of a crossover. it's a place that, like the state of Guerrero, has a long history of political corruption and political violence. But it's also, as we know, it's been a center for drug trafficking and a zone of conflict between different drug trafficking organizations for a long time. That the present, in quotes, drug war, most people say, began in December of 2006 with President Felipe Calderon declaring this war, and the first state that he targeted was his home state, Michoacan, a state he couldn't really visit even as president of the country. So Michoacan's really interesting because the Tierra Caliente where this happened has had a long history of political violence that actually precedes the drug violence. It's also, of course, a center of operation for some of Mexico's most volatile cartels. You go through the history of this from the Valencias to the La Familia, the Knights Templar, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, other groups that are in the south and Guerrero that are there, a presence of the Sinaloa cartel, Michoacan, and the Tierra Caliente have always been of interest to the cartels. So it's sort of these two things crossing, a history of political violence and a history of drug trafficking. And the killing of this mayor, I think, attracted the attention that it has, in part because I think Mexicans are tired of this, and it was an opportunity to speak out. It's a particular moment, but also because he was so brave. This is a guy who said, look, we can't have this. And, my own party, a government that I voted for, hasn't been able to handle this. We've been waiting for a solution for this for too long. And as mayor, I'm not going to back down. And he was killed for that. And now his wife has taken up the mantle of standing up to organized crime, standing up to corruption, and she has assumed his office. So it's an incredibly captivating story in that sense. Like, here's a local guy standing up, and he's not just calling out and saying, oh, they're narco-terrorists, they've done all these terrible things. He's saying, look, no, the government at all levels has failed the people here. And that was, I think, a really powerful message. And the fact that he was killed so soon after delivering that message is really what made this a catalytic moment in Mexico.
And he had asked for protection. He felt his life was in danger. And a lot of people are blaming Mexico's President Carlos Sheinbaum for not providing enough security to make sure that nothing happened to him. And a lot of people are to the point where they're blaming her. As you mentioned, they're getting tired of all this violence. Could this be the moment that sort of sparks a revolution in Mexico to finally try to oust these drug cartels?
I don't know. I think that people are desperate for change and may be willing to look for some different options. On the other hand, I would say that I don't think it's quite right to blame her. I mean, the federal government in Mexico is in a terrible spot with regard to these organizations because they're held hostage by them too. A lot of the money for them and most of the guns comes from the United States. They're in a very tense binational moment, and no one has been able to control them. And in Mexico, we've basically seen three very different strategies for dealing with them. One, Calderon, which was like full-on military, declare war. Then the PRI kind of came in and tried this negotiated thing where they tried to empower this individual states to take them on and then kind of make deals to create a new kind of peace. That didn't work. Morena came in and said, abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. But at the same time, they also created a whole new military force, the Guardia Nacional, and basically doubled down on the militarization of the drug war. At the same time, they're trying some alternatives at the local level. And they really stripped states of the ability to do it. And they said, yeah, we're doing that because the state governors and the state police forces are all totally corrupt, hopelessly corrupt. That was their theory of the case. None of them have been able to make much of a dent. And so politically, who knows? But I would say that, Sheinbaum is very powerful, is very popular, and she's popular because she stood up to the United States, and because people perceive her as an honest broker. And I haven't seen, among the other parties, anybody really, emerge who could play that role. Now, I think when you see a popular mayor assassinated, it's not good politics to sort of say this is out of our hands. No political leader would survive saying that. But that may be the reality. And I think that a broader awakening and saying, well, okay, we're blaming the government for this, but what are the rest of us doing? Have we changed our consumption patterns? Have we really asked what our police are doing? Are we supporting them? Are we calling the police when we see things like that? And like things like that, the record of unreported crime, like we call it the cifra negra, the black statistic in Mexico, or the black hole, is really high. And in a lot of places, it's 90% for most crimes. And I think things like this maybe could catalyze some change there, where people say, you know what, I want the president to take more risks. I want my governor to take more risk on my behalf, but I have to take some risks too. I have to say, look, I saw that and I'm going to report it. And that's really hard to do because, these organizations work by terrifying people so that they become quiescent and don't stand up.
We're speaking with Dr. Everard Meade of Proceso Pacifico, and we're going to continue this conversation after a really quick break, so stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. We continue the conversation now with Dr. Everard Meade, the director of Proceso Pacifico.
And we were talking about Mexico, the residents, people of Mexico, perhaps getting tired. There was a very powerful senator, a member of the Morena party, and he brought up an idea to create a recall election on the president, just as a way to prove that she is still very popular. You think this will ever fly? Any legs to this story at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise in the sense that, AMLO, who brought this Morena, the party, into existence and was, and really brought it into as a supermajority, across the government, was very fond of doing a referendum. And he did various versions of referendums and plebiscites to justify his policies and to sort of silence his critics. And so I think what Monreal, I mean, it's a bit odd to do it through a recall. It's, the recall in support of, but I have no doubt that if they did one, she would probably win. I mean, that's what most of the data says. I do think she has a pretty high approval rate. And even if, even if there are misgivings about government generally and the inability to protect people in particular, again, an alternative hasn't really emerged. There isn't an alternative, either popular movement or political movement that looks like a real contender. I also think, too, that the relationship with the United States has really strengthened Claudia Sheinbaum. This having this very contentious relationship with the United States has made people in Mexico say, yeah, I'm willing to criticize my president, but in front of Trump, I'm with her because she's us. And I think that's a very real effect. And it's something that that's happening all over the continent, too. I think there are opposition parties on the right who are doing the opposite, that are becoming more popular because they're saying, look, we can have a better relationship with the United States because Trump will like us better than them, based on the experience of Argentina, for example. That's happening in Colombia right now. So, but yeah, I think she's in a pretty strong position. I don't see, I mean, if anything, that their position has been unsustainably strong for a really long time. So she may just be kind of coming back down to earth. I mean, honestly, when you're polling like 60, 70% in a modern democracy and you're able to maintain that for years, it's kind of incredible.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the economy in Mexico, and specifically the debt. It's said that under the 6 years with AMLO, the first year with President Sheinbaum, Mexico's debt has doubled, due in part to a lot of big failed projects like the Tren Maya, the Felipe Angeles Airport in Mexico City, the Bienestar National Pharmacies, and the Mexicana, the airline that at times has been flying with 2 to 3 passengers per flight. Mm-hmm. How is this going to affect this country moving forward when so much money is apparently being wasted?
Yeah, the long-term investments. I mean, they also bought Dos Bocas, the refinery, and that one's worked. So I guess there are two. So the one asterisk that I would put with that is Mexico's debt to GDP ratio is still really low. It's way lower than ours, for example, in the United States. So, and AMLO, his most frequent critics for most of his political career were from the left. and there were frustration with him not borrowing money. So, he was actually kind of a fiscal conservative as far as lefties go, especially in America. So, but yeah, no, these were big projects. They were signature projects, and insofar as they're a referendum on Morena, it's a pretty mixed bag. I would say that again, we have to be careful because there's a lot of the political opponents sort of. Yeah, it is true the debt has doubled, but it's still insignificant as a portion of GDP, right? So, and there are people left, right, and center who would argue that Mexico actually, because it has a good credit history, should probably borrow and invest more. I think what will be most interesting to see with this government going forward will be the plans with Pemex seem to be, that's the stuff that could either go really well or really badly. She has really doubled down on Pemex, which is interesting because she knows a lot about, she's an expert in energy and environment policy, and they're stuck with a Pemex that's kind of bloated, that everybody knows is corrupt. There's this huge black market for huachicol, which is the counterfeit gasoline, contraband gasoline, I guess is the right way to say it. But they're stuck with this big investment in that, and that has certainly crowded out private investment and probably cost Mexico tax revenue. At the same time, she wants to make these big energy investments in sustainable energy, which Mexico is way late to the party and probably should do. Mexico has solar resources like almost no other country in the world, and if you put the panels up, it would work. Everybody says that. So yeah, it'll really depend, I think, on how well that pans out. If they get the energy policy right, where they can manage the transition to renewable, they may come out way ahead, and that would be a big win for her. But could also go really badly. I mean, a couple more revelations of $1 billion lost here and $1 billion there, especially on the huachicol, which is something that Andrés Manuel López Obrador said he was going to fix, and he did not fix. That could go really badly. The other thing too is Mexico is really vulnerable to external shocks, and so some of the success or failure of the economic policy may have nothing to do with what Morena does. It might happen. It might have to do with what happens here or what happens in the global economy. If we have a major recession, the price of oil falls off a cliff. Mexico's hugely dependent on Pemex. Mexico would be hurt really badly if a recession produced a really dramatic fall in oil prices. So yeah, or if trade policy all of a sudden with the United States hit another couple of headwinds, ran into a wall, and Mexico ends up with astronomical tariffs again. We saw a taste of that in the spring, how badly that could go for big industries in Mexico like manufacturing. So I honestly think the externalities might be more important than what the government actually does. It's very important to watch the debt to GDP. Mexico is not actually a huge debtor country. It's in way better fiscal shape than most of the Americas. But it is true, the big projects have yet to pan out.
Let me ask you about tariffs. I know a lot of the trucking companies in Mexico here in the Baja California area, they're complaining that their trips across the border, deliveries were down 40% this year. They expect things to continue in this way next year. So how are tariffs playing out in all of Mexico, not just necessarily along the border here between the U.S. and Mexico?
They're really hurting. They're really hurting. And I think Americans don't realize when, Mexico, right on the eve of this administration, Mexico is the largest trading partner in the United States. And Mexico, Canada, and China have all been kind of 1, 2, 3, and they move around depending on how you measure it. But when you take that and then you add tariffs on top of that, and then when you tariff the countries that are the countries of origin for some of the things that go to Mexico to be manufactured, like China, for example, or chips coming from Taiwan and other things, that affects Mexico too, because a lot of that stuff gets assembled here, like the televisions are assembled here and they go there, but the chip isn't made there. So Mexico kind of gets a double whammy because they're not the end destination. And so the good produced in Mexico is, it has this extra cost added to it, which affects demand for it, makes it more expensive. You're going to sell fewer of them. But also the factor market, all the things you need to make the thing got more expensive for Mexico to bring in. So there's a bad cycle there that I think is really important. The other thing is a lot of the stuff, Mexico has sort of two economies that are export oriented. One is the like real basic manufacturing that you see along the border with Texas. Parts of the Tijuana economy are this way, where it's real basic assembly. That's the value add, and it goes. But Mexico also has this huge auto industry and heavier industries that are much longer horizon investments. When GM builds a plant in Mexico, or Hyundai or Volvo or one of their suppliers, they're not expecting to make money like in a year or two. They're investing in heavy industry that's often a 7 to 10 year horizon before you make any money. And if you interrupt that and drastically change the sort of terms of the deal because you have to sell the stuff at a tariff premium, it's incredibly disruptive, and it takes a little bit of time for those inventories to go down and for people to realize what the real impact is. So I think Mexico is probably just starting to feel that, and it's definitely negative. And it's something that manufacturing it's showing up in the United States too. Our manufacturing data shows it very, very clearly. There's critical parts that people need. We pay attention to the phones and the rare earths, from China because it's a small device and they're a key cog in that. But if you look at more complex things like cars, refrigerators, appliances, that's stuff that all has part of the manufacturing, at least in Mexico. It's a North American market. And if you mess with that, it takes a little longer to come out in the economy, but there it is. And all of a sudden, you're going to have people who are going to be have to lay off workers, and it's going to have the macroeconomic effect will start.
And countries like Korea are thinking of pulling out of Mexico altogether. So that's going to have a double whammy down there. So I wanted to ask you about something that Rudy mentioned at the beginning of our live stream. He talked about drugs, in particular, a bust that was made here in San Isidro with heroin. We see more heroin. We're also seeing record busts in ports of entry, bridges along the southern border dealing with cocaine. Are cartels getting back to these oldie but goodie drugs instead of the fentanyl?
Yeah, it's always a kind of cat and mouse game. But when you have such a federal focus in the United States on one thing, fentanyl, inevitably that there's so much pressure on that. There's pressure on the precursors. There's attention and intelligence assets that are watching all the ports for the precursors to come in. They're madly scrambling, trying to find the laboratories that make that thing. Then, and also, there's been some success in the United States on the demand side with fentanyl. The overdoses peaked and have come down for a couple of years now. The crisis in overdose deaths in emergency rooms and stuff. There's still way too many deaths. Everybody agrees, but it's way down. It's not at a crisis point. And so at each step in the process, you're going to see a return to some of these other things where there's established networks. Heroin, you need a poppy field. Cocaine is mostly transshipped. A lot of that cocaine is synthetic these days. It's not all that different than the fentanyl in the sense that it's just precursor chemicals. But then you've got poor rural economies that are under a lot of stress right now. In Colombia, in the Andean region, which include parts of Ecuador, parts of Peru, and the same in Mexico. And that's an option. It's always been part of the mix. And so if you have a macroeconomic crisis because of tariffs, because of some of these other things, some of these producing regions are going to start producing drugs again.
We've been speaking with Dr. We've been speaking with Dr. Everard Meade, Director of Proceso Pacifico, and just as I predicted at the beginning of the program, we are out of time. I wish we could go longer. We appreciate you being here today, sir.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me on, Rudy. Thank you very much, Salvador. It's always a pleasure. What a great show.
All righty. Well, stay with us. Border Report Live will be back in 1 minute. And welcome welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Meade, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas. We took you all the way we could with Dr. Ev Meade, always a great guest to have on the program. But before we leave, we did want to remind you of a couple of things. Don't forget that you can stay informed on the story shaping the U.S.-Mexico border while you're on your commute, walking the dog, or maybe you're hitting the gym, because Border Report Live is now available in podcast form. You can listen at any of those platforms that you see at the bottom of your screen. And don't forget, tomorrow we have a new episode to check out of Political Power Ranker. It's a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. I got to take part in this week's episode earlier today, and it is covering everything that happened on election night this year. So you're not going to want to miss that if you want to get ready for the next cycle, which is in March, at least here in Texas. That is going to do it for us today. For Salvador and San Diego, my name is Rudy Meade here in Harlingen. We'll see y'all tomorrow.